In this video, I will be exposing the so-called Rhea Jernigan, Child's Play Ninja, the so-called Brandon Sanders, Maximum Overload, and the so-called Jugganati. I will remain anonymous due to safety concerns based on my findings about this so-called group of elite juggalo cloud bankers. I will, however, give a short detailed history of my dealings with them. On June 24, 2018, I came into direct contact with a man who called himself Rhea Jernigan online. We began sharing selfies of one another and identified with each other as juggalo homies, discussed the meanings of the dark carnival, life in general, and the meaning of being a true juggalo. After a week of correspondence with Rhea aka Child's Play Ninja, I was approached by a man at my place of business asking me questions about my gang affiliation. This was a complete shocker to me as I work in a female clothing store, I'm 5'4" and am not a gang member. I was approached by a man in his early 40s wearing very out-of-place clothing for my area. I live in South Florida, Dade County, yet this man had what appeared to be a winter coat on and the day was at least in the high 70s. He demanded I show him my ID and asked me if I lived with my parents still at my current address. This question chilled me to the core as the man showed no identification of his own and I had no idea how he had my personal information. He knew my full name, age, address, and place of business. I began to panic. When my shift leader noticed I was having a meltdown, she calmly walked over and leaned up against the counter to listen in so she could come to my rescue. After the man began reciting all of my personal details, she asked him why he needed my ID if he already had this information, and promptly asked him for his before she was forced to call the police. The man replied that the police wouldn't help us because I am a known gang member and he was on assignment to interview me by the federal government. He then flashed a badge that looked official and said he was FBI. The man then turned and walked out of the store very quickly. Later on in the evening when I returned home, my mother could see I was still very visibly shaken. When she asked me what was wrong, I said nothing and went into my bedroom to undress for the evening and try to calm down. After washing up and putting on my bedclothes, I decided to turn on my Facebook Messenger and confide in my juggalo friends and tell them what had happened to me at work. That night was the beginning of a living hell for myself and my family. The first person I attempted to contact was Rhea. We had begun a sort of romance from afar through texting and I just wanted to run into his arms and have him talk about this on his show. When I began speaking about this, Rhea began laughing hysterically on our Facebook video call. I was completely disgusted that he was laughing at me, but it took a much worse turn a bit later. After berating me for nearly an hour, calling me a dumb bitch and a gang member, Rhea then began asking me to perform sexual acts for him on camera. When I told him no and that I was very upset with him, he responded, "Who do you think sent the federal agent, you worthless cum slut? Now let me see that pussy before I have them raid your house and kick in your mother's teeth." I will never forget these words or how callous he looked. This was my second panic attack of the evening because, even though we were getting close, I had not disclosed I lived with my parents out of embarrassment because he had made a comment that only losers live with their parents. When I began to cry uncontrollably, he promptly hung up on me. That little stab at my heart is what made me block Rhea. I may be a college-educated woman, but Rhea is very manipulative and abusive and had me under his control emotionally. I felt like suicide at that moment. I was so confused as to why he would have a weird-looking man approach me at work to scare me after everything was going so well between us. How he found out all my personal information, and what he actually wanted from me. Enter Brandon Sanders aka Maximum Overload. The very next morning as I was getting dressed for work, I began hearing ding after ding on my Facebook Messenger, and then my personal cell phone number. I had over 20 notifications before I managed to get to my phone, only to discover it was a man I didn't know at all named Brandon Sanders. Physically exhausted and emotionally drained, I answered him instead of blocking him, although my instincts told me otherwise. We were somehow already connected on Facebook, even though I had no recollection of ever speaking with him. Brandon called himself Maximum Overload and said he was there to help me. I had heard his name around the Juggalo internet but didn't know much about him. He told me that Rhea had sent him to apologize and that it was mere coincidence that I had had a police officer approach me at work. That this was all a mistake and that Rhea really cared about me. He was very convincing. By the end of the conversation, I wasn't even sure I had seen anything the day before other than some practical jokers sent by one of my real-life friends. Throughout the day I conversated with Brandon, who turned out to be very charming himself. He sent me a batch of his songs via email and I listened to them over my lunch break. They were audibly amateur but very, very good. Brandon called me after I listened to them but refused to get on camera. I could hear the sound of keyboards typing away as if there was a secretary in the room, and could hear multiple people having a faint conversation in the background. Brandon had claimed to work selling marijuana, but his workday sounded more like one spent in an office. I asked him about this and he brushed it off as his co-workers, and I didn't think much of it at the time. Over the course of the next week and a half, I spoke to Brandon for more than 40 hours total. I was beginning to fall for him as I was very emotionally vulnerable and had rebounded off of my previous rebound in my ex-boyfriend and then Rhea. Brandon begged me not to expose our calls or the amount of time we were spending together to Rhea, as Brandon had told him we only spoke once. It was during this conversation that Brandon let something slip. If you tell that quote-unquote fucking federale on our conversations, he would have him locked up. I asked Brandon what he meant by that. Brandon then said he had to go, and I heard a woman in the background yelling at him to get off the phone. Later that night, my sister, along with her children and husband, came over for dinner. My brother-in-law used to be a private detective who specialized in workman's comp cases. I gave him both Rhea and Brandon's names and asked him to look into it the following day. He agreed and we went about our dinner. The following morning my brother-in-law called me to inform me he had spent all night looking into the two and had come up with some very strange anomalies. First, that Rhea had had his criminal record expunged in such a way that only high-level law enforcement could have achieved. Second, that Brandon Sanders did not even seem to exist, had no online presence until 2016, and seemed like someone so private that might as well have been in witness protection. This information made me so sick to my stomach that I literally vomited at 3 stoplights during my commute to work. Rhea hadn't spoken to me in a week and Brandon wasn't responding to my texts. It wasn't until almost the end of my shift my brother-in-law sent me a picture of Rhea and Brandon at the Juggalo March in 2017. He then sent me a picture of Rhea holding a sign that said quote-unquote "The FBI listens to Nickelback."